Every empire had to rise. For good or ill, any country that has called itself an empire in our long history has had to overcome countless challenges to finally achieve dominance and rule over their vast lands. Empires define our history and our discussions on the way the past worked. For that reason, it's no wonder that we love writing about them and creating them for our own stories in the modern day. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. This is a sister video to our previous How Empires Fall video and our Kingdoms and Empires video. And while we've talked about how empires collapse and how they operate, none of those things are possible if they don't come to exist first at all. These origins will always be prominent in the minds of an empire's people, for by existing, such origins offer themselves as a constant reminder of what their forebears once achieved. So, given how varied empires are and how many kinds of empires there are, we are going to divide this video up into different archetypes. These will be based on historical figures that represent different ways empires have risen in the past, so that you'll have a real-life example to work with and potentially research in writing your own empire of that archetype. And the first of them will be Type 1, the Genghis Khan. Rapid, violent, and a source of incredible horror for their enemies, the Genghis Khan archetype of empire is low in stability and high in aggression. Even in the pre-modern world, Genghis Khan managed to be responsible for the death of tens of millions, a record that even the most brutal of 20th century dictators struggled to match. For this reason, when we see a Genghis Khan type empire in world building, they are pretty universally going to be regarded as a villainous force, and for fairly obvious reasons. They embody all of the most terrifying qualities an empire can have. Aggressively expansionist, violent and oppressive towards those they conquer, entirely extractive in their attitudes towards the conquered, and ruthless in their reprisals. Really, the conquest of Genghis Khan alone was so traumatizing to all the cultures that experienced them that the entire idea of the relentless horse-raiding marauder spread across Eurasia and has remained in the collective consciousness ever since. It is, of course, worth noting that Genghis was not the first person to do this, however, and that Attila the Hun might be an even more relevant example of this empire archetype, as he was the OG steppe raider, so to speak. His rampage across Europe is part of what pushed the Goths into Latium, resulting in the eventual conquering and fall of Rome. West Rome, that is. There are a few things that made this possible that you'll probably want your own takes on if you're aiming to create an empire of this archetype. The primary one of those is military superiority. To say it simply, the Mongols had such a mastery of cavalry, particularly with their unique usage of horse archery, that fighting them on the battlefield was almost always a losing proposition. The best their enemies could do would be to lock themselves up in their keeps, from which the already nomadic Mongols could essentially afford to just wait and siege them out. Thus, for your own empire of this archetype, you need military superiority for this kind of empire. It also helps for their enemies to be in a state of disunity. This was the case in the Kievan Rus, which had been deteriorating for quite a while before the Mongols arrived, and thus when they did, it was not able to put up effective resistance. As an example of this from my own universe, I have a culture that fits this kind of archetype fairly well. Much as I like pulling closely from history in my writing, that empire occupies a steppe and is nomadic. Yet, rather than a mastery of horse archery being the ace up their sleeve, it is their propensity for taming massive monsters that don't even exist in the rest of the world, much less get regularly utilized for war. So when that faction shows up on the doorstep of nations that don't actually have giant monsters, it becomes something of a problem for them. The next key factor in writing an empire like this is that they are almost by definition extremely unstable. They don't take the lands that they do because they care about them per se, but only because they can enact violence and extract wealth from them. This does not, shocker, lead to the building of strong institutions or friendly local governments. Genghis Khan's empire only lasted about as long as he did, at least at its fullest extent. And while it maintained influence over the places it conquered for centuries afterward, it was as a fat cat that basically sat around shaking money out of the cities that would one day rise to conquer and entirely replace it. Muscovy would be the biggest example of that, almost entirely subsuming them in Eastern Europe. Attila had even less influence after he died, as his empire fell all the way apart after his death. The nice thing about all of this, however, is that this archetype can be just as interesting in its rising state as it can be in its falling state, as its falling state leaves behind a power vacuum that will, in all likelihood, lead to the rise of something that will fill that vacuum. In summary, with the Genghis Khan archetype, the empire is always growing, for it can have no period of plateau, no stability. It rises, and as soon as it's not rising, it's falling. And next is the Napoleon, or alternatively, the Caesar. You might say,
"But J-Bat, Napoleon was like Genghis Khan. He conquered a bunch of territory and then his empire fell apart."
and while that isn't false per se, there's a lot more to it than that. And that is because Napoleon shares an angle with Caesar, and that is of reforming an existing nation, in particular a republic, into an empire. Despite how specific this sounds, it's actually a lot more common than you might think. The best example of that is that a relative of Napoleon, Louis Napoleon III, would do the same thing his predecessor did about 40 years later. There are countless others, though. Lenin and the Provisional Government of Russia would be another one. His process isn't anywhere near as simple as it seems when you hear about it in high school history class. It's a long, painful, and often extremely calculated chain of events. In the Louis Napoleon III example, he took his existing popularity to first become president as opposed to emperor. It took him several years to leverage his influence and power to slowly strip democratic protections out of the government before he finally declared himself emperor. Lenin, as our other example, was not anywhere near the obvious choice for the leader of a post-Great War Russia. His party, the Bolsheviks, were with good reason viewed as violent radicals and the last choice for the provisional government. Yet the provisional government couldn't help but fumble over itself time and time again as it kept trying to fight World War I. In the chaos and the violence, Lenin managed to leverage the situation to turn the radicals into a major force, fight a civil war with that major force, and then somehow at the end of it all become the ruler of Russia. Of course, this archetype can be expanded even further. It doesn't have to be a republic forming into an authoritarian state and thus becoming an empire. The important thing, essentially, is that said empire comes about after a change in governmental style, usually one initiated by a notable figure, Napoleon and Caesar being two of the most important historical examples of such. Regardless, the kind of person that pulls that off will definitely be one for the history books. This can also be played in a lot of different directions. The ascendant leader may be leading their country through an era of prosperity, or they may be a cruel warmonger. But reform is the through line. A change in the status quo of not only who is in charge, but in what way the leaders are in charge. Thus, this kind of reform will often in of itself be the basis of the ideology that guides the leader and nation. Napoleon, for example, was the epitome of an enlightened despot, disempowering the classic institutions of France and replacing them with his own absolutist methods. Thus, your empire and your ruler become an exploration of whatever ideology or concept it is that has defined their rise. Our next archetype is Type 3, the Peter the Great. Another way of looking at this next archetype is the normal ruler plus option. That is to say that unlike the Napoleon, they do not fundamentally destroy the previous system, but they, in being a part of it, perform so far above and beyond the average that their successes lead to the rise of an empire. These ones have existing institutions, traditions, religions, and what have you. And whereas in the Genghis Khan example, their institutions are either not enforced on their victims at all, possibly because they're dead, or entirely enforced through brutal force, and unlike in the Napoleon, where the institutions have to be rebuilt, the intrigue here comes in that they are expanded. That might have been a slightly confusing sentence, but I hope that makes sense. It is in this empire type, which functionally is one of the most common types, where the incorporation of new lands in of itself is going to be more of a focus. These types, generally being less radical, are often less scorched earth when it comes to their tactics. All the same, Peter the Great, to use our example, became so well known for a reason. He may not have led a revolution, but he was still revolutionary. In his intensive efforts to westernize Russia, the newly founded Russian Empire saw greater cultural changes just during his reign than it probably did throughout the whole last century. New technology and ideas were imported, and despite predating the Enlightenment, Peter the Great is often considered one of the first enlightened monarchs. Thus, if you'll have an empire like this, one that has, in some primordial form, been around for a while, you'll need to consider what exactly kickstarts its rise into a great power. To take another example, one could refer to Otto von Bismarck. Sure, Prussia existed before he came around, and it had its part to play in European politics, but it was not a great power. Nor was it an empire. Yet through warfare and the calculated usage of his realpolitik philosophy, he saw Prussia become the North German Confederation and then the German Empire. His secret was that he was basically playing a different game to everyone else, entirely unafraid to manipulate, which he did many times to achieve his end. And in terms of institutions, he brought the existing German ones with him as he expanded the empire. A conservative, militaristic, aristocratic Prussia became a conservative, militaristic, aristocratic Germany. Yet, some of the issues that might have otherwise plagued him were absent, as the cultural differences between Prussia and those places he conquered, while they did exist, weren't immense. This same situation would play out very differently, for example, in the Ottoman conquests of the Balkans. The Turkic Muslims and the Balkan Orthodox Christians never did get along very well, and thus these tensions eventually turned into rebellions, wars, and finally, independence in those Balkan countries. In general, the Peter the Great archetype may be gradual, and it may not be quite as dramatic as some of the others, but it is one of the easiest to justify in universe, and the one where a focus on internal politics might have the most room to breathe. After that, we have the Romulus. You might say,
But J-Bat, Romulus wasn't even a real person.
I hear you, and that is in all likelihood true, but I'm onto something. The Romulus archetype is not extremely common in real life, in the sense that the Romulus archetype of empire is one that rises from nothing, so to speak. It's one that goes from at most scattered tribes to a real power block in a short span. This archetype is thus less present because the figures that might have been responsible for it date back far enough to be nearly mythical in most cases, much like Romulus. Even someone like Emperor Jimmu of Japan, who probably was a real person, has a history that is poorly known about simply because most of the information about his rise and the specifics of his life either weren't recorded, were lost to time, or basically became myth. I bring this archetype up, however, because these can be really useful if you're writing fantasy, where ancient empires that have been around for almost forever are a really common staple, and thus they are worth talking about. Especially since, even if they're long dead, they may well still be able to tell your protagonist about their lives for themselves, much like Rauru in Tears of the Kingdom. Even if they can't speak for themselves, whatever groups or people brought this ancient empire to the forefront may still be around in some way to convey what happened. Of course, this is a video on the rise of empires, so while there's still plenty to talk about when it comes to living in an empire that has existed for such a long time, when it comes to how they came about, there are a number of approaches. One of those is to lean into the legendary nature of such a thing. It isn't uncommon for fantasy worlds to have been more magical, more chaotic, or what have you in their distant past, so more outlandish enemies or conquerors may well fit in such a scenario. Perhaps such an empire was so wrapped in the mystical as to be founded by actual deities. Often, this approach will be spare in details. There won't be court politics, deft maneuvers, and brilliant tactics, but general notions of the founders settling and building up empty or undeveloped land, perhaps uniting tribes or slaying monsters, those will all sort of be around. Great example of this might be Sigmar Unberogen from Warhammer Fantasy. He was a mighty warrior who united otherwise disorganized tribes into an empire. He struck up an alliance with the dwarfs after the legendary Battle of Blackfire Pass, then founded an empire to form a power block strong enough to resist the oncoming forces of the Greenskins and Chaos. Then, of course, he was said to rise to godhood, and worship of him became dominant in much of that empire that he founded. However, you can take on more literal interpretations of the founding of an ancient empire, given that the core idea here is that such an empire is built from almost nothing, that there was no established thing being revolted against or built out of. Every single institution that exists in this kind of empire needs to be created from scratch. Thus, as your empire rises, So should religions, legal traditions, armies, and all the rest. I have something more like this, though it's a bit of a modification. One of the empires in my universe, that of Bastaria, was founded in such a way. After an ancient disaster that decimated the original, extremely ancient empire, the peoples of the continent were broken apart from one another and existed in decentralized tribes for centuries. However, when the prophets of the soon-to-be major religion of the land rose to prominence, that being Auridian, he did so alongside a powerful warlord, Hiatus. Thus, this new religion and empire came to be around at the same time and built institutions where there had been none for several centuries. The last kind of empire is in some way the least conventional and also possibly the newest archetype, the George Washington. The idea here is that the George Washington archetype is an empire that is founded not by creating something from almost nothing, not by overthrowing an existing nation, nor improving upon that which exists, but explicitly breaking off from an existing empire and making something new, particularly in such case where this breakaway state is culturally or geographically distinct from their original ruler. I use George Washington as an example because he was more or less the figurehead of the American Revolution and the first president, and that eventually the United States became something that could fairly be called an empire, one that would even surpass the British Empire it came from in certain ways. This archetype might often sprout from a colonial setup where a colony rebels and now, on its own, is able to prosper and make its own decisions. While the USA is one of the most well-known examples, there are plenty of others. This also ends up being pretty distinct from anything like the Napoleon, simply because the goal is not to destroy the empire that exists already, merely to successfully rebel, create distance, and prevent any sort of reconquering. If you want something maybe less known, but more conventional in this sense, Sweden would be a great one because for a while it was ruled by Denmark under the Kalmar Union. Yet in 1523, under King Gustav Vasa, Sweden became independent and would grow into an empire that would play a significant role in European politics, at least until that other archetype guy came around. However, this can be a really fun one, largely because it'll need to beat a more powerful enemy to even be able to start rising. We all love underdog stories, and this might be one of the best ways to do it and see it through. There is plenty to say about how such war might be won, as, unlike what YA dystopian novels might tell you, a single plucky teenager and their love triangle is probably not enough to successfully rebel against a tyrant. Superior tactics, good motivation, and importantly, another powerful country to sponsor such a rebellion are all things to consider as reasons that victory is actually realistically possible. Once your rebellion has succeeded, it is then time to pay mind to what they are actually going to do with their newfound freedom. They'll have the institutions of their previous ruler to work with at first, but how might they actually modify those? Sure, English common law was a big influence on the early governance of the U.S., but then, of course, such precedents were modified until the U.S.'s politics became properly distinct from the British. With all that in mind, I think we've covered several ideas for how you might want to world build the rise of an empire. If you have any thoughts of your own about rising empires, or any other such events that you may be writing, I read every comment and would love to see them. In addition, every single like and subscription goes a long way because we're still pretty small here at JBats. We also have a Discord if you want to hang out with my editor and I, and a Patreon if you are crazy enough to want that. We post all our videos there a week early. I'd also like to thank Shadowrunner and Sani, our Knights of the Inner Circle, Nico, our Knight, and Greer, our Loyal Squire. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed, and remember, if you get exiled to the island of Elba for trying to conquer Europe, maybe just call it quits there.